Have you ever looked at world history and just felt like there's a huge piece of the puzzle missing? Well, today we're digging into this really fascinating and, let's be honest, pretty startling report from 1994 that claims there's a secret key to understanding the last 500 years. And it all boils down to a lesson in strategic intelligence. So let's jump right in. So, right off the bat, the report drops this huge mystery on us. It makes the claim that for 5 whole centuries, some kind of hidden force has been pulling the strings, manipulating world events, orchestrating wars, revolutions, you name it. The big question is, what is that force? Well, this explainer is going to walk you through the report's absolutely incredible answer. Okay, but before we get to the who, we have to understand the how. The report starts with this idea, a paradox really. It says that if you just analyze one single historical event by itself, you're always going to miss the bigger picture. To see the real pattern, the hand pulling the strings, you have to step back and look outside the event at the system that's connecting all of them. And this, right here, is the fundamental question that drives the whole report. It asks, how on earth did the very enemies of human progress, of creativity itself, somehow wind up in the driver's seat of history? It's a massive question, and it sets the stage for an even bigger answer. So our investigation doesn't start in some dusty archive. It takes us to a very specific time and place, London in the 1850s. At this point in history, it's the undisputed center of the largest colonial empire the world had ever seen. The report basically calls it a new Roman Empire, right there on the banks of the Thames. So who's running this new Rome? Well, according to this report, it's not Queen Victoria. Nope. The real power, our prime suspect in this whole historical mystery, is the mastermind of what it calls a secret empire, a man by the name of Lord Palmerston. And the report really paints a picture of this guy, Henry Temple, Lord Palmerston. Sure, he was prime minister, he was foreign secretary, but across Europe, they had other names for him. He was known as Lord Firebrand. And get this, in Vienna, school children apparently sang a song that said, if the devil had a son, that son was, you guessed it, Lord Palmerston. And Palmerston, he wasn't exactly hiding his ambitions. This quote here just perfectly nails his whole worldview. He stood up in Parliament and declared that any British subject, anywhere on the planet, was backed by the full might of the British Navy. Civis Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen. He was literally proclaiming a new universal empire. Which, of course, brings us to the next logical question. How could one guy, operating from a relatively small island nation, actually pull that off? I mean, Britain's army was kind of third-rate. The fleet was powerful, yeah, but it was also vulnerable. So how did they do it? And here we get to the absolute heart of the theory. The report argues Palmerston's real power wasn't military. His method was something totally different, something it calls the multicultural human zoo. The concept is as simple as it is, well, chilling. If you can control a nation's culture, you control how its people think. And if you control their minds, you control the nation itself, all without ever firing a shot. And just look at how this zoo was supposedly set up. It wasn't one big cage, you see. It was more like a series of ethnic theme parks. Palmerston would create or hijack these nationalist movements, each with its own tailor-made ideology and a very specific strategic goal. You had Young Italy over here, designed to keep the peninsula in constant turmoil. Young Germany was programmed for conflict. Young Poland was aimed right at Russia. And Young America, that was all about fracturing the United States using slavery as the wedge. Now, a ringmaster can't run a global circus all by himself, right? So the report claims Palmerston relied on a core group of agents. It gives him a pretty colorful name, his 3 stooges. These were the key guys tasked with executing his grand strategy on the ground. So first up, you've got Giuseppe Mazzini, described as the revolutionary mastermind, the head zookeeper, if you will. Then there's Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the future emperor of France, who basically provided a powerful land army that Britain could use for its own projects. And finally, you have David Urquhart, who ran what you could call controlled opposition, funneling any dissent into this rabid hatred for Russia. The report really zeroes in on Mazzini as the main operator. And his playbook? It was brutal, it was effective. He weaponized populism, turning it into a kind of political religion. He allegedly ran an assassination bureau to just get rid of obstacles. And he preached this doctrine where your rights as an individual meant absolutely nothing compared to the so-called destiny of your nation, or what he called racial collectivities. And here's where you see the sheer cynicism of the whole system. The report claims that these agents were often deliberately pitted against each other to create even more chaos. So you'd have Urquhart over here publicly screaming that Mazzini was a secret Russian agent, while at the very same time, Mazzini's own people were plotting to assassinate their fellow stooge, Napoleon III. It was just a perfect storm of controlled chaos. But just when you think you've got it all figured out, the report throws in a massive curveball. It argues that Palmerston didn't even invent this method, he just inherited it. The real origin story, it claims, goes back centuries, and it starts in Venice. To back this up, the report points to the British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, who actually wrote that the goal of a powerful faction of the English aristocracy was to create a republic modeled on Venice, turning their own kings into nothing more than figureheads, or doges. This group became known as the Venetian Party. And this wasn't some overnight coup. The report lays it out as a 200-year project. It supposedly began all the way back in the 1530s, with Venetian agents advising King Henry VIII. Then in the 1600s, you have the Venetian Paolo Sarpi developing the philosophy of empiricism, which then gets exported to England. This all leads up to the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which set up an oligarchy, and it was all cemented in 1714 when George I took the throne as a Venetian-style doge. So why England? According to the report, as the city-state of Venice started to fade, its powerful ruling class needed a new host for its parasitic system of finance and control. They looked at England, an island, perfect for building a global navy, and saw it as the ideal new body to carry their virus out into the world. Okay, and this brings us to the philosophical core of the entire argument. The real empire, the one that Venice designed and Palmerston perfected, wasn't ultimately about land or armies. Its ultimate weapon was the idea. It was an empire of the mind.
And that central idea, the intellectual virus of this new empire, was something called empiricism. It's the philosophy that says all knowledge comes only from what you can see, hear, taste, touch, and smell. The report claims this wasn't just some abstract theory. It was a weapon, a tool of control.
This intellectual framework, it was built up piece by piece over generations. It started with Francis Bacon, who brought the method over from Venice. It was then developed by guys like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, and finally, according to the report, it was weaponized by Jeremy Bentham, creating a worldview that essentially traps the human mind in a prison of its own senses.
In this chart, this really puts the whole theory into perspective, doesn't it? It argues that while we all focus on the military and economic power of the British Empire, its real foundation, its greatest strength, was always its control over philosophy and ideas. That was the source of its true lasting power.
And this, the report concludes, is why the empire never really went away. It just changed its clothes. It shed its physical territories, and now it exists in a much more powerful form, as a set of shared, often unconscious intellectual assumptions that still shape how a huge part of the world thinks today. So the report leaves us with this final, really provocative question. It asks us to totally reconsider what an empire even is. What if the most powerful, the most durable, and maybe the most dangerous empire isn't one that controls land, but one that controls thought itself? What if the bars of the cage aren't made of iron, but are made of ideas?